Thank you all for joining. I do see it looks like our people have successfully been coming in from our waiting room. So I will go ahead and get us started. So welcome. Hello. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Bernadette Austin. I am the Chief Executive Officer for CivicWell. We are thrilled to have you join us today for the second installment of our fall webinar series, where we discuss cross-sector and holistic approaches to the various challenges we face. We're very proud to bring you insights from some of my favorite colleagues and friends who are change makers working at the intersection of fields like climate, health, transportation, and community investment. So if my colleague could please put the webinar chat into the webinar linked into the chat. You've obviously found yourself here, so congratulations. We really hope that you can join us for some of our future webinar topics. On that note, I welcome you to join us on Halloween. That's when our next webinar is, where we're going to hear some case studies and learn about funding and resources available to support climate disaster recovery and resilience at the local level. This was a topic that I was really interested in sharing with you all, and it feels incredibly more timely given the tragic impacts of Hurricane Helene. So, our thoughts are with those communities that have been deeply impacted. So we really do hope that you can join us for that climate disaster resilience webinar series. This entire series is sponsored by AARP California, which is committed to the efforts that improve livability across our state, including access to a variety of transportation options for aging populations. All right, so with that, I'm going to introduce our wonderful and esteemed colleagues. All right, let me just check my chat, make sure I've got everything tracked. Wonderful. All right, so first we are going to hear from a couple of colleagues who have been working at the state level. So Nailah Pope-Harden serves as a Deputy Director of Equity and Tribal Affairs at Caltrans. In her role, she directs the development and implementation of equity initiatives and strategies for our state's transportation network. She has spent more than 15 years advocating for transportation justice, racial equity, environmental justice, and climate action. We will also then hear from Sequoia Erasmus, who serves as the Associate Deputy Director of Equity and Engagement with the California Transportation Commission. In her role, she supports and advises the Commission in its racial equity goals and co-facilitates the Interagency Equity Advisory Committee with lead staff from Caltrans and CalSTA. She has dedicated her career to improving community health outcomes and increasing access to open space and culturally relevant recreation opportunities and advocating for safe and accessible mobility. So both of these individuals do have a background in community and advocacy work, and they're also joined by Russell Dawson Rawlings, who has worked in this space as well. He currently serves as statewide community manager for the California Foundation for the Independent Living Center. He oversees the Disability Organizing Network and provides direction for the Foundation's community organizing strategies. He previously served as chair of the Sacramento City Disabilities Advisory Commission, vice chair of the Disability Action Coalition, or DAC, and board member of the Sacramento Regional Coalition to End Homelessness, and president of Dogfight, Disability Organizing Group for Initiating Total Equality, a Sacramento area disability advocacy group. So you can find our full bios in the link that we're about to provide in the chat. Maybe that's already happened. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to our first speaker. I will note that this is a webinar. We really encourage you to use the chat and Q&A functions. We will provide quite a bit of time towards the end of this for you to pose your questions. So please, as you're listening in, please feel free to use the chat and Q&A functions. And with that, Nailah, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Bernadette. And thank you, everyone, for coming on a post-lunch webinar. I had fajitas, and I can feel myself getting drowsy as I'm speaking. So I will try and bring some energy myself. Nailah Pope-Harden, I am the Deputy Director of Equity and Tribal Affairs here at the Department of Transportation, Caltrans. I have been in my position since April of 2024. So when Bernadette says that I come representing state government, that is very new and fresh, about 6 months. I do have about 15 years prior to that and doing community organizing and standing on the other side of many of these conversations, which I think brings a very unique perspective into a lot of the work that I do here now at Caltrans. So just a little bit of background about my office and how the department is thinking about equity. So Caltrans for a while has been doing a lot of equity work that was spread out amongst our different districts and different programs within Caltrans. My office was created in April of this year when I became deputy director to really become like the center of equity work for the department to make sure that we are being consistent and streamlining and making sure that we are providing the most equitable and just representation that we can. Some of the things that Caltrans does that falls under like my branch, my office that I manage are we have our equity statement. We have a race and equity action plan where we're breaking down by program and by different Caltrans districts across the state, different ways that we can engage in equity and advancing equity. We have our equity advisory committee, which Sequoia is going to be talking about more. It is an interagency effort that Caltrans does along with the CTC and CalSTA. We have our transportation equity index, which I'll touch on a little bit more. We also just do general equity coordinations with all 12 of our districts. I think I saw some of our district equity leads in the audience, so that's lovely to see you guys. So we work closely with district equity leads and these new community engagement coordinators, which I also will touch on a little bit. We are tasked with creating a director's policy for equitable engagement. So if I am doing my job correctly, hopefully everybody on this call will at some point receive a message from me asking for more feedback about how do we collaboratively create a policy for equitable engagement at Caltrans. That's something my office is tasked with, and I want to be very intentional about getting a wide range of feedback in order to inform that policy. Some other things that are under my office that aren't super pertaining to this office, but we also do a lot of the tribal affairs work. So in my office, we also are the ones who manage the Native American Advisory Committee, which is a part of Caltrans. We also have been working on just tribal contracting and consulting and making sure that all of our tribal practices are up to par. And then also another thing that my office is doing a little bit is some of the innovative transportation equity research. So we're trying to ask some really difficult questions and hopefully and trying to pair with researchers that can help us answer them. So um, again, my background is in community organizing. I like to say that I was one of the most critical people of Caltrans and their equity work, and then they called my bluff and have hired me. And so it is this beautiful foundation that was laid brick by brick, where there was a need that Caltrans tried to fix, created a program, did something, and it's a bunch of bricks put together, and it's my job now to kind of bring those together instead of just filling holes with programs. How do we create something that's larger, consistent across the whole department? Whether one district will jump in and fix a need, and that's wonderful, but how do we replicate that across 12 districts in Caltrans is a lot of my job. What I want to dive into today, because I think we can talk a lot about the way that I like to think about equity and transportation equity is there's like the hearts and minds, where that's where we get the stories, that's where we talk to the people, that's where we're amplifying like folks' lived experiences, which so important, so valued. But in transportation, we also have to speak engineer. And so there's also this data side of transportation and transportation equity that Caltrans is really trying to explore. So I'm going to drop in a link to our equity index. Don't get too distracted by it. Just feel free to look into it later. But basically, this is a spatial tool, a GIS tool that starts to help Caltrans develop a definition for, oh gosh, I'm going to get tongue tied. Hold on. For transportation based priority populations. And so this is essentially our version of a disadvantaged community, except this adds as additional layers of traffic exposure, access to destinations, and really looks at some of those other indicators that are in like our Cal Enviro screen and other indexes, and starts to pull out like where can we find transportation-based priority populations. And we're starting to use this and figure out how we can use this tool to inform a lot of our funding practices, a lot of our decision making and policies moving forward. The other thing that we are doing pretty innovatively in terms of transportation equity is some of the work with our community engagement coordinators. So these are folks that are in all 12 districts across the state that are tasked with being on project development teams and basically analyzing, working through like what the community engagement policies and practices are happening on projects. They won't necessarily lead or facilitate those. Where again, this is a long path to transportation equity. In terms of these community engagement coordinators, we are at the beginning of that path. So right now, they won't be doing the engaging on the projects themselves, but they will be doing like some overarching looks into how districts are managing community engagement. And on the back end, while they're doing that, we're also working to create a director's policy of community engagement, which will memorialize some of those best practices. So what we're talking about is sometime in the near future, we have this equity index that are showing on a map where we see transportation-based priority populations. We have these community engagement coordinators, which are tasked with creating a better, more efficient community engagement. And it also creates a portal where we can start to database where are the engaged communities, where are the community needs, where are people pointing out that they have issues. Can we populate that on our EQI map? Very soon, the next version of our EQI will also have what we're calling like equity mitigation. So, hey, this community is a transportation-based priority population. They are transportation insecure. There's been a lot of community engagement that's showing that this community has an issue. Here goes some populated things that you can add to a project that may help alleviate some of the burden that may be providing. Maybe you need a sound wall. Maybe you need to plant more trees. We're starting to build that into the equity index, and we're actually looking for folks that can help, subject matter experts that can help us like quantify some of those burdens. So I'm going to leave it there. I think what I will paint a picture of is just when you think about how trans equity work right now, think of that analogy. Like we built it brick by brick. We put bricks, better yet, no. Think of a leaky wall, right? We taped it up, right? We filled in the leaks. And right now we're trying to build something a little bit more substantial that can move us into, the future. Thank you.
Thanks. I was struggling with my mute button. Thank you very much for that perspective. Something that, as someone who formerly worked in research, we really think about what we track, what we value. And so that's a big reason why tracking data, what we're tracking and how we use it for accountability is really important. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to turn it over to Sequoia with the CTC.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks to Bernadette and Haley at CivicWell for organizing this event today and for inviting us to be part of it. It's an honor to serve with you, share some of these experiences with. My name is Sequoia, and I serve as the Associate Deputy Director of Equity and Engagement with the California Transportation Commission. And I have a couple of slides. I am joining from my tablet, so I have no idea if they are on the screen.
Well, if you wait just 1 second,
okay.
I'll get those up.
I can see us, and that's enough for now. So I'll keep going. I serve with the California Transportation Commission on the planning team as the Associate Deputy Director of Equity and Engagement. And I have been in this position since June 2021. So about 3.5 years now. And it's been quite a journey to come in kind of similarly to Nailah, to come in at a time when there was a lot of energy and momentum and need, need that was not new, but had been needed for a long time to address equity and justice in transportation. And my background, as Bernadette mentioned, is in community organizing, and I had been working and serving in Richmond, California, in local government, and in Contra Costa County, organizing with bicycle and pedestrian advocacy. And so going then into state level work and being able to focus on transportation equity and also mobility justice has really been an honor. And I'm grateful that now, even 3.5 years later, our three agencies are still demonstrating a commitment to and actions towards improving equitable outcomes throughout our state. And now more than ever, as I'm sure all of us on this call know, these initiatives are becoming more and more at risk and throughout our country. And so the fact that in California, we're really doubling down on this work and keeping it going amidst everything else that's going on is really important. And, I'm really grateful for our leaders and for folks on my team, especially Nailah and Russell, who I get to work with outside of this panel. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background on where we're at least with the California Transportation Commission, which I'll add is part of kind of our three pillars of transportation departments in the state. We have kind of where our secretary sits, the policy arm, the California State Transportation Agency, or CalSTA. We have the operations side, which is Caltrans, where Nailah sits. And we have the commission, which our main purpose is to review and approve funding applications and make sure that everything's kind of in alignment with NEPA, with CEQA, with federal and state law. So in 2021, in alignment with CalSTA and Caltrans, the commission released it's our racial equity statement that says that our commission recognizes that throughout California's history, improvements to the state's transportation system have disproportionately benefited some population groups and burdened others, and that the commission condemns all forms of racism and is actively working to promote equitable outcomes through our programs, policies, and practices. And in that statement, we also include actionable goals, which I'm proud also to mention that all of these goals are either in progress, parts of which have been accomplished, but they continue to ground us in our work and continue to be priority actions for the commission. So in our statement, we also say that the commission will work to build and strengthen relationships, and that includes with our other agency partners and advocate communities and local communities and Caltrans districts, folks across the state who are working in transportation. Our goal is to just have better communication and strong relationships to improve equity. Additionally, at least in 2021, we were working with what was the Equity Advisory Roundtable, and the commission was dedicated to empowering the roundtable and future-related efforts to help inform transportation decision-making. The roundtable, which advised just the commission, expanded to broaden into what's now the Interagency Equity Advisory Committee, which I'll talk about next. But it serves in an advisory capacity to Caltrans, CalSTA, and the commission. And so the second bullet has been expanded to all three of our agencies. Third, the commission will strengthen understanding of community transportation needs and challenges, and that we're working on with our Interagency Equity Advisory Committee, with our advocate partners, with partners throughout the state. Additionally, the commission will ensure equity, public health, and robust public engagement be a planning and programming guideline. And that has been a large part of the work stream of our Interagency Equity Advisory Committee, for example. And finally, the Commission has been providing expanded opportunities for commissioner and staff trainings related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we held a year-long training for commissioners and executive staff at the Commission. And now we're launching a 3-year tailored training for all Commission staff. We're a staff of about 40 people, to root us into how all of us are part of the equity puzzle, and all of us have a job to do relating to improving equitable outcomes in transportation in our state. That it's not just me, Sequoia, as the equity lead, but in fact, all of our team who are responsible, and all of what we have to do matters. Next slide, please. So Nailah mentioned that we work very closely on facilitating and serving as liaisons to the Interagency Equity Advisory Committee. And this is a big piece of how our agencies are in direct communication with equity experts from across the state to make sure that when we are kind of in the proposal process or working on our funding guidelines or program guidelines, we are creating and dedicating ourselves to having these conversations with equity experts to better understand what are the most important pieces of transportation equity that we need to be including in these pieces of the transportation puzzle in the state. Environmental justice policies and principles, making sure that we are weaving those in appropriately and adequately, and equitable economic opportunities, especially as related to transportation planning and programming. And because we know that, we want to ensure that people not only can get to jobs, but they have meaningful jobs. And we're also, beginning a conversation around just transition and thinking about how investments in sustainable transportation systems can also support investments in sustainable workforce practices, and thinking about kind of beyond fossil fuels, what that looks like, and making sure that people throughout our state are able to tap into this bounty of opportunities that's coming into the state with all these new initiatives. So our advisory committee consists of up to 15 members, and as I mentioned, it's from folks who represent historically marginalized voices, and they advise our 3 agents on important topics. Next slide. So this is my last slide, but I wanted to show an example of what members of the Equity Advisory Roundtable and then the Interagency Equity Advisory Committee were able to provide advisory support on, and also help decide on who should be awarded funding in terms of reviewing applications and seeing who was engaging in communities in the way that our members really valued as equity experts. So in 2022, the Senate Bill 1 funding programs invited Equity Advisory Committee members to review project applications in this 3rd funding cycle of the competitive program. And 2 of our members had time to evaluate responses to the community engagement criterion of the project applications. And these members helped determine which projects were awarded over $1.7 billion available in SB1 program funds. And I use this as an example because our roundtable members, which Nailah was actually part of during that time and was that person, helped craft the funding language of these program guidelines. And then we were able to loop in the future Equity Advisory Committee members to help evaluate the community engagement piece of this. And so this is kind of a full circle of how some of the opportunities our equity advisory committee members are able to shape how money is spent in California. And that is something that our three agencies are very much that is in our wheelhouse. And by having these opportunities for our members to provide their input and help determine where we should be spending money, I think that really helps bridge the gap of we don't have to have people just yelling into the void of, hey, let's do this. We're actually able to have people at the selection table and helping shape what that looks like. And so I'm really proud of how this worked out, and we plan on continuing to involve members in future allocations of this funding, as well as other funding streams that the commission is responsible for. So that is all. Those are all my slides, and I'll leave it at that till Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. For our attendees, I'll let you know that the slides and this recording will be available after. I'll also highlight that we have some really great questions coming in, and I'll highlight for our panelists. I think one of the ways that after we hear from Russell, love to hear sort of your definition or your insights on the term transportation equity. An example from the chat is, what is meant by equity? I assume it refers to people. Does it also include modes of transportation? Yes, both. Yes, people and modes of transportation. So I'll plant that seed for our folks. I also think it's important to just highlight that decision making should be driven not just by data, but also the lived experiences. And so that's definitely a through line that we're hearing. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Russell and hear what your thoughts are.
Thank you so much, Bernadette, and I'm really honored to be here today. I am Russell Dawson Rawlings. I am the Community Organizing Manager at California Foundation for Independent Living Centers, and I'm going to start right off by saying that I am by far the least fancy person in this room. Everyone else here is at a state level. My background is very, very, very different. I am really glad to see both Nailah and Sequoia here in the room with me. Otherwise, I probably would have just said absolutely not to a conversation of this nature, because I'm a person with a disability, and my experience, both in lived experience and professional experience, have been working with California's disability community. And again, as a person with disability, my first issue was transportation. I'll just be honest, and I'll give a little bit of a brief scenario why I was really, really genuinely honored to be asked to be a part of this. As someone who has cerebral palsy, I have depended on access to support for my mobility for all of my life, since I was very young. Since I was born, I was unable to walk, so I made use of assistance from my parents extensively through my childhood, who provided much support to me as I grew into an adult. And I was someone who was very privileged in that I had access to assistive technology. I have a power wheelchair, and I've been driving a power wheelchair since I was, I believe I started at 4, and I got my first power chair, got to take it home by 5. And have been driving a powered wheelchair ever since. So that was really my first mobility, right? And in some ways it was amazing, because I was able to go much further and faster than a lot of my childhood, friends, even in a rural West Texas setting. We're pretty much the chair was more or less able to go anywhere except where there were physical barriers, and there were lots of those, right? Like if you have a wheeled vehicle, a curb, or even a random hole is a barrier. So I experienced lots of those, growing up. I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about them. I just navigated around them to the best of my ability, and kind of grew up in a world that was full of those kinds of things. And I didn't have access to public transportation, or in many cases even good pedestrian infrastructure. I was in areas that where these things did not exist. I tell everyone, I didn't know, buses and public transportation were a thing until well into my adulthood. So I actually had attended university at Texas A&M University and still wasn't really kind of connected to the idea of public transportation, even in that environment. What I did start to notice is that the environment was very oriented in a way and organized in a way that pedestrian access was prioritized and encouraged. And it transformed a lot of things for me. You know, no longer did I have to worry about, can I get to this event or this thing quite as much, unless it was in, you know, a house, which inevitably all the good parties are. And so anyway, long story short, I felt isolated and trapped, and it was really honestly my access to a different set of infrastructure, the internet, that gave me really any kind of feeling of, and I'm sure I want to kind of leave that question of what is the definition of equity on the table, but in that, you know, in regard to my access to the internet, I feel like I was actually extremely privileged. So it's, you know, it's kind of that idea that you can be very disadvantaged in one area and very privileged in another. And fortunately, I was extremely privileged in my access to internet early in my life, even as a teen. So I had the idea, you know, that there were other things happening and that were, you know, not all communities were organized like the one that I grew up in or that I was experiencing. And in 2001, I made the decision to move to Sacramento, California, from Houston, and it changed my life. For the first time, I was able to get on a public bus. Actually, at the time, I used Super Shuttle to get myself from the airport in Sacramento to where I was going to be living, because at that time, and still today, the airport in Sacramento continues to be a very kind of relatively underserved area of Sacramento. But there was fortunately a Super Shuttle that was filling that transit need. And from that point forward, I was able to navigate not only my local immediate community, but you know, through time and just learning how buses and the light rail system worked, the entire greater Sacramento region. And I think within my first or second month here, I had actually independently traveled to the Bay Area and back. And that was super transformative for me. It was the actual, you know, first time that I was experiencing the ability to move without having to think about everything in depth and make extreme planning processes or just rely on others to support my transportation, which again is entirely how I'd lived my life up to that point, relying on my parents for transportation. So fast forward again a little bit more, you know, my journey here in California began because I put myself forcibly in a different environment. What I didn't have here was any support whatsoever, other than one person who had agreed to be my roommate. So I was very quickly forced to learn how to navigate the world by using, you know, the knowledge of others. And I connected with the local Independent Living Center here in Sacramento, Resources for Independent Living, an organization that is run by and for people with disabilities to aid any person with a disability in finding and accessing resources, and exactly what I was needing. I needed somebody to help me understand how I was going to survive in this environment. And I am glad to say that all of that work led to me actually working in independent living. And I was hired in 2017 as the Director of Advocacy at Resources for Independent Living. And, you know, have brought myself to the position where I'm now working in a statewide capacity, supporting all 28 independent living centers in California on addressing the shortages, right? Talking about what systems change looks like. It's a very, you know, it's a great position to be in many ways, because we can dream and talk about the future. It's also a very complicated situation to be in because we are actually receiving state and federal funding. So we have to kind of create these opportunities to start conversations like the one that we're in now, and you know, build support and educate and mobilize people. But we can't, of course, you know, propose or support like direct lobbying activity, which does make our work somewhat challenging. But you know, transportation again was the first thing that I identified as a barrier. It's also the first thing that I advocated for as a person. That first day at Resources for Independent Living, I can still remember that the previous executive director there, longtime executive director there, Frances Gracechild, was herself a power chair user and saw me and didn't know me at all, just saw me in the talking with one of the independent living specialists and asked me, hey, do you use public transportation? And I said, yes. And she said she needed somebody to talk about it because they were renewing a local transportation tax, Measure A, here in Sacramento, and they needed somebody to talk about the value. And I remember I kind of just rambled through the fact that I had just arrived from a place where these bus and trains were just a myth and not something that I knew, even in the metro area of one of the largest cities in the US, whose, again, the suburban landscape was just not organized for access. So I think I might take a bit of a pause, other than to say that I do have one thing. I wouldn't be doing my justice as doing justice to my position as an organizer to ask a really important question, and this will be one that I'm sure is not answered here in this time that we have together. But I'm super excited to see that all the transportation agencies are organizing together to start talking deeply about equity, as is much of our state government, actually. But I'm worried that it's happening in some silos. For example, the Disability and Aging Community Living Advisory Committee, or DACLAC, is a committee of CalHHS, which actually has roots in its work as being known as the Olmstead Committee, or the committee that is required to look at the state's health and human services programs and make sure that they are complying with Olmstead, which is a Supreme Court decision actually that says that people with disabilities should be allowed to live in the communities of their choosing. And the key part of this statement, of course, is that resources and services have to be made available. So we're really good in disability a lot of times of starting with health and human services and building out sometimes, but sometimes that becomes like a barrier in and of itself, where we have people with disabilities who have, lives that are very much more than just our diagnosis or some set of medical circumstances. We are, in fact, complete people and need these, concepts like the Olmstead decision actually applies to all state and federal government funding. So I would encourage maybe us, as we're talking about equity and bringing these things together, to be sure that we're bringing in partners such as DACLAC and finding ways to make sure that they too are part of these large table equity discussions, particularly because the last week I spent in Ventura County at the first ever Disability and Government Summit in Ventura County. It was an amazing experience where many people with disabilities in various pieces of advocacy, my organization and several others locally there in Ventura, were able to speak directly to people at government level. And a lot of it was local government, Ventura County and surrounding areas, but it was so rich, the conversations that we were able to have in partnership that way. And I actually learned about something that's relevant for what we're talking about right here, right now, is that the California Public Utilities Commission has created the Access for All program based on funding created from SB 1376, which requires a 10-cent tax on every TNC, so that's Lyft and Uber ride. It all goes into a big pot of money that the CPUC is now required to build a program around to create accessible program service for people with disabilities that require wheelchair accessible vehicles. That was an awful lot of information, and I know I'm bringing something really huge to this table, but I want it to kind of be a goal that we talk about this and that we find a way to bring this into the conversation and not keep it isolated over in the CPUC, but bring it over into the transit spaces that we have here with Caltrans, CTC, and CalSTA. So that's kind of my challenge for us in the short time that we have together. And I'm excited to get into the weeds and have a discussion with everyone.
Yeah, really excellent. And I think too, you opened with, well, what else can I bring to this discussion? And clearly you bring a really rich perspective. And myself having known folks like Nailah and Sequoia for several years, I know that those two and myself, we bring our lived experience to the work that we do. And we're recognizing when there's folks who haven't had some of the shared lived experiences that we've had, it's important to have people like that who have a seat at the table, decision-making roles, whether that's in an advisory committee, leadership roles, et cetera. So very valuable perspective you bring, Russell. So I wanted to kick things off with, how do we define transportation equity? Keep it kind of short and snappy. And then I'll move through some of the questions that we have been getting in the chat and via Q&A. So if you have not yet, but have something that you'd like to contribute, we'd love to hear from you. So again, please use a Q&A in the chat functions. So let's go in the reverse order on, how would you define transportation equity, and or what does this conversation around equity include? So Russell first, and then we'll hear from Sequoia and then Nailah.
Oh, wow. Putting me back on the spot after I just spoke endlessly. All right. So transportation equity, it looks like being able to move from where you need to be to where you need to go without barrier and without impediment, without judgment, right? So most people have some level of transportation equity. Some people are extremely privileged in their transportation. Others are extremely disadvantaged in their ability to access transportation. So the equity process then is making that fair, making it equitable, making sure that there is a lens through which we are evaluating who is not getting what they need and how do we bring them to where they need to be in terms of transportation. For some people, like underserved communities, they need more support than those who have a transit, transit-rich environment. People always ask me, why did you move to Sacramento? Why didn't you go to the Bay Area or something? Well, I had a roommate here, and I'm sure it's no surprise to anybody. California is an extremely expensive place to live in. And, so I built my life here. I am now afforded some opportunities that I've not had in the past, and who knows what future decisions I may make around things. But the bottom line is, we shouldn't need to have to relocate. I shouldn't have, I'm glad I did it, but it shouldn't be an experience that everyone has to go through to take themselves out of their home environment and forcibly relocate just to be able to experience a more equitable transit environment. And really, honestly, I had to go several thousand miles away to do that for myself, from my home. So I think that would be my short definition.
Yeah, thanks, Russell, for sharing that. I'd say, speaking on behalf of the commission, what we are sort of tasked with in the state, which is really distributing and approving funding programs. One of the biggest ways that we can improve equitable outcomes in transportation is first recognizing and atoning for past harms and addressing that our agency and our agencies have been perpetrators of harm. And without acknowledging that, we can't really move forward. One of the ways, though, that we can move forward and is also within our purview is really understanding that we can and should and are flipping the script of who we're seeking as experts and who are we engaging with at the table, or whose tables are we trying to go sit at, or inviting folks to our tables. And for us, those equitable practices can help inform and ideally result in more equitable outcomes in transportation, which looks like ensuring that funding is distributed to areas that have been historically underfunded or disinvested in, that we are able to pivot when necessary, if necessary, to help fund projects that need more attention. And I think this is a hard one for state governments, the pivot part. But you know, we can still work on figuring out ways, and those push points, the small things that result in big changes. But yeah, like definitely transportation equity for us is making sure that anybody who wants to come to us as a partner or engage in dialogue with us has a chance and engage with us in our meetings, or we'll figure out a way to engage outside of the meetings. Understand public meetings are hard, and in the middle of the day, and not everyone's available. So we try to do our best to meet people where they're at.
Yeah, so I think there is the honest answer about how it is showing up in the lived experiences of folks in communities every day. And then there's the more like lofty philosophical answer of which we strive to. And so I think when we talk about equity, I will just say personally, my frustrations often with these conversations, it is mostly race and income, right? We use equity to talk about race and income, and we are missing so many different groups that have been historically underserved in the transportation sector. And Russell, it's one of the reasons why I always appreciate working alongside you, because I grew up in South Sacramento in a poor neighborhood. I can talk about that all day. But when we talk about accessibility issues, while I can understand what it's like or have feelings of what it's like to not have accessible transportation, that's my experience. It is nothing compared to it's nothing compared to the experience Russell is having. And being able to stand along those people is paramount. Finding ways to elevate those voices, but not just elevate them, because elevating voices can also often look like tokenizing. And that's not something we necessarily want to do. Finding ways to elevate those voices, I think, are really important. It's part of what we're doing with the community engagement coordinators, where we're trying to look at like, what does engagement look like widespread? I think one of the other things that I'm very challenged by when doing equity work is I think there's this confusion, and I'm trying to use all the politically correct words here so I don't get myself in trouble, right? But there's this confusion sometimes when we talk about equity, about creating these big buckets that everyone fits in. But really, sometimes when we do equity work, it really is about narrowing down in the communities that have been historically underserved and finding a solution for them. Great examples like language access. We could talk about language access all day, but like, what languages? We need to figure out where these specific people are. What languages are they speaking? What communities are they in? Are they in a spatial geographic area? So sometimes when we talk about equity, we try and go really broad and be like really inclusive. But I think we need to start finding avenues when we talk about what equity means and how to actually, I don't want to say silo, but how do we have those like pinpointed policies that are going to help communities? How do we also like manage both? I think is part of the conversation. I also was just in Bishop, California last week, and was just completely challenged by the idea of even what a rural community looks like, because that's part of the equity conversation. For me, equity is almost any community that has been underserved. We were really good at building roads so people can get to where they need to go, regardless of like environment, regardless of people's needs, regardless of like whether that induces demand in the long run or not. We just built roads. And now there's this conversation around who has been underserved in the historic policies and how do we create space for them. And so I think a lot of that will look like going broad, but a lot of it is also going to look like very pinpointed and like concentrated conversations with populations of people who have been left out of conversations before.
Yeah, I love this perspective. Thanks so much. So I'll first go to a question from the Q&A section, and this is probably a question for Nailah about the EQI tool. Caltrans gathers data on its performance, such as pavement quality, bridge condition, etc. Is that data parsed out by, I'm assuming other factors, to determine if conditions in underserved or disadvantaged communities differ from those found in other communities?
Yes. Okay. So I'm glad that we're talking about this because I tried to do an answer in the chat, but I'm dyslexic. And so trying to get the nuance and pay attention was too hard. I was like, no, I have to say this one. So the answer to that is almost. Not quite yet. I think the EQI tool came online in March of 2024. That is a tool that we plan on using. So we already have our transportation asset management plan, and we have a lot of other plans, but I think that one specifically is talking about pavement and bridge repair. It is a goal at some point at the next update of that plan to use EQI to help evaluate that. So we can have a more precise measurement on what's happening in our disadvantaged communities.
Yeah, really good insights. Thanks for that. This next question is probably for Sequoia, but if others want to weigh in, they're welcome to. Asking about the Interagency Advisory Committee. So I provided a link for folks. Does the Interagency Advisory Committee identify and comment on inequities in our laws, practices, and engineering standards? So if you want to talk a little bit about what they do, that would be great.
Sure. Okay, so the committee is wrapping up its second year as a committee, and there in the website that's linked in the chat, there is a whole scope of what the committee is kind of tasked with in an advisory capacity for our agencies. So definitely includes transportation, planning guidelines, funding program guidelines, state transportation plans, quantitative and qualitative metrics for evaluating equity benefits and outcomes, such as the EQI that Nailah has been talking about, how to incorporate meaningful community engagement practices into all aspects of transportation work, assessing equitable outcomes in projects, policies, and programs, and developing recommendations regarding best practices to elevate equity in project planning and delivery. So that kind of links into laws, practices, and engineering standards. And as I mentioned earlier, by bringing in EAC members into, for example, state funding program guidelines creation, language creation, they're able to offer advice on, how to ensure that the way that we're crafting language, for example, around community engagement is going to push agencies and entities who are applying for the funding to engage with communities in a way that is not performative, maybe identifying projects based on what communities have already been asking for example, and demonstrating how community members, and community is not a monolith, we want to distill it and make sure that we're looking at broader aspects of community, and folks who are agencies who are applying for funding are being asked to distill that and show that and use examples of engagement beyond just we put a flyer out. And so that's something that our advisory committee members have helped kind of develop within funding guidelines for SB1 and are working on developing for other funding guidelines. And so kind of brick by brick, but as these funding pots are worth a lot of money, it can really have an impact on some pretty meaningful aspects of, at least in our case, funding program in the state.
Yeah, really helpful. So I see that we have about 5 more minutes. So I'm going to consolidate a couple of similar questions, and whoever wants to respond or in whatever order would be great. I think there's definitely a question around outreach, engagement, and accountability. Sequoia, you've already started referencing this, but so I'll put together 3 questions. One person stated, government entities, nonprofits, and businesses are often oblivious to public transit service. What outreach and policies are being pursued to encourage choosing locations and schedules that facilitate using existing public transit schedules? That's one question. And then a couple are a little bit broader than that. One is how to make sure that policies and processes correlate within agencies and translate into the communities we serve. And then the third I'll throw in the milieu is government outreach is often limited to organizations with little opportunity for participation from the general public. Some organizations become more focused on preserving and growing their organization than on their own stated mission. How is the general public being included? So again, different questions, nuances, but I think if anyone wants to talk a little bit about that engagement from the individual community level to organizations, and then perhaps from like local or transit agencies. So anyone wanted to comment on that?
Can I quickly offer maybe from the community perspective? This is Russell Dawson Rawlings, and for us, you know, it's always a challenge, even in mapping my own experience. You know, as a person with disability, I learned how to advocate for transportation on my own. To be honest, I didn't have a lot of support. I started at Regional Transit, which was a local transit agency, because it was the most in front of my face. It was the one that I felt like I needed to talk directly to them about their own services. It was through, being in community and space that I learned about, the councils of government and the role that they play. It's a very elaborate process. So in the interest of time, I'd say maybe one of the things that we should ask for in this space is more support and funding to help make the entire process more transparent and equitable for everyone. I mean, I know that independent living centers can do a lot to educate people, but again, there's limited resource and staff focus and time. Most independent living centers don't get to focus in the weeds on one particular issue. They're trying to help everyone to the best of their ability in a number of large critical issues. Dedicated funding would be my for assisting people navigate.
Yeah, thanks, Russell. And I think regarding the transit piece, that is a really hard piece of the puzzle for our agencies to address, because that, at least for the commission and a lot in a lot of ways for Caltrans as well, we do not oversee local transit. And a lot of times our funding can go towards transit buses and things like that, but not necessarily to operations and who's going to actually drive the buses, the workforce. So there are things that are a little bit out of balance and can cause a lot of frustration. There is a transit transformation task force being currently convened with the California State Transportation Agency, or CalSTA, and they are addressing some of those questions. And I think a lot of really interesting recommendations are coming out of there. And then I wanted to also address kind of how to incorporate community engagement and voices, and how or how not are we listening as agencies. And I will say that working with the commission is probably the most public facing agency of our 3 transportation agencies, and we have regular public meetings with very, very robust public comment periods that sometimes go on for hours and hours. And when comments are made or when letters are written, we are listening. And a lot of times they will really shape how we understand projects. We are also engaging with community groups and advocate groups way before the public meeting even happens. So a lot of these conversations are happening. It may not be happening in the public meeting, but at least at the commission, our staff, we have an open door policy, especially when agencies are applying for funding. There's a lot of opportunities for conversation, but I also acknowledge that it requires a level of kind of professional advocacy to be able to spend an afternoon waiting to give public comment at a meeting. And that's not available for a lot of people, especially individuals and communities who are suffering, who are bearing the brunt of our transportation decisions. And so with sort of this model that we're building out with the Equity Advisory Committee, and as Nailah mentioned, bringing this into our individual Caltrans districts, being able to have district level advisory committees where community members can go, and individuals who aren't necessarily professional advocates can have a space to voice their needs, their concerns, plug into project planning, different pieces of the puzzle. And then that gets taken to districts, which then gets taken to kind of the higher level executive offices of the state. Those are definitely things that we're working on and that we acknowledge there are a lot of gaps. But I also want to really say that when public comment happens, we are definitely listening and we are really, really engaged. So sometimes it feels like it's going to the void, but it's not.
I appreciate that. I'm gonna give Nailah the final remarks here, and I'll just note again that if you are attending today, we will have the recording and uh, uh, links and the presentation available online shortly. Nailah, last word to you.
All right, I'm going to drop my information in the chat so that folks can reach out if they'd like to, because I think to the question about engagement, like I said, we're working on an equitable engagement policy and we want to engage a lot of people to create that policy. I will say, so I come to this work because bus service was cut from my neighborhood. That's one of the first organizing campaigns I ever worked on. Transit is, while everything Sequoia said is so true around just our purview and where we oversee transit, Caltrans is actively, though, trying to find ways to make transit easier. And so we are propping up and working on a transit policy and creating a transit division and beefing up transit in our in Caltrans. In terms of engagement, though, I think it is to the question around organizing the organized. I think, yeah, it is difficult if you are not already a part of a collective group or community to be engaged. And we're actively working on figuring out how we can break that silo. Welcome folks to reach out to me. I won't take too much more time. And I also think that as we develop the policy, Bernadette, I would love to bring it back to this space or share it with folks in this space to get as much feedback as possible to move it forward.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. So please join me in thanking our panelists. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar series, and I will take Nailah up on that offer. I think that there's a lot of opportunity, whether it's a webinar or perhaps something at one of our in-person gatherings that I think would be really useful. All right, we will share out contact information with attendees via email as well. Thank you all so much.
Thank you
Thank you.
for having us.